We've got quite a lot to cover in the next few days, so I'm sorry we've had to go quite quickly over things, but it's just so you can get an idea of how things are. I've got a very short talk now. It's just about why paper deteriorates, and then we also want to talk a little bit more about collections and how you go about managing them. You know, whether it's in a museum, in a monastery, in a private organisation. So I'm going to talk about the conservation and deterioration of paper first, and then I'm going to hand over to Anne. She's going to give her presentation, which is a little bit more about collections management and preservation. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to talk about, first of all, environmental factors, about how they affect how paper ages and deteriorates. So by environment, I'll go into that. We're talking about light, temperature, humidity, those sorts of things. I'm also going to talk about handling and physical damage to things, because by and large, most of the damage that occurs to manuscripts or paper or any museum objects are because of us and what we do, human intervention. Damage caused by acidity. When paper is made, depending on what the paper making materials are, it is either acid or alkali. Cotton papers, cotton and linen, which is, and to a certain extent sort of jute and rami, some of the other fibres that are used here in India, when they begin their life are either neutral or slightly alkaline, depending on the water in which the paper's made from. But newspapers, we've all seen, like modern machine-made papers that are made of wood pulp. Those things deteriorate very rapidly. They're probably on the acidic side when they're made, and as they age, they become more brittle and they become more acidic. So acidity is quite a problem with paper. So the environmental factors, it's all pretty obvious stuff. Temperature and relative humidity. Basic chemistry is that as the temperature increases, so does the rapidity in which things deteriorate. So, a rise in temperature of 5 degrees makes a big difference to the rate of change that happens. So all of the things, and it affects the breakdown of the fabric of paper. It also, in turn, with light and ultraviolet, it also brings that down, the breakdown in the structure of the paper, which is what causes it to be weakened. Light, we've all seen the effects of light damage on textiles. You've probably seen it on furnishing textiles, you've seen it on tanker paintings, possibly in your home, you've seen it on brocades, you can see it, the effects of light particularly on poor quality papers as they become yellower as they age and they become more brittle. Ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet is contained within daylight. It's present in all of the light in this room. It's present particularly in daylight and to a certain extent in some forms of artificial light. But ultraviolet is ultraviolet's the most active component in bringing about deterioration. So in the point of view of controlling the particularly light damage, then exclusion of ultraviolet completely is totally desirable. We don't need it in order to see objects in their true, with their true colours, but it is present in daylight, and many people think that direct sunlight is damaging, which it is, but what a lot of people don't realise is that all light, all daylight, will cause fading and deterioration. So limiting the light levels, we've got the blinds down here, but if you're in a room, if you're not there, and it's got a very high level of daylight, damage occurs. Damage will occur with all daylight, but the idea is to limit the kind of level that your collection is exposed to daylight particularly. So keeping things in boxes, keeping things covered when they're not being looked at, putting things away when you're not using them, is is a good example. Probably less of a problem here in Himachal is, sulfur dioxide and pollution from car exhaust, from industrial pollution. There's a lot of dust also, which is present even in quite, a long way away from cities. There's still dust and dirt. So that's also a factor in causing deterioration, because, particularly with atmospheric pollution, that also will generate acidity. So sulfur dioxide, on paper, as it's absorbed by paper, particularly with relative humidity and temperature, it causes decay. These things, they're all interlinked. So the temperature and relative humidity, obviously, we know is interlinked as the temperature goes up and the humidity goes up. But light and ultraviolet, which is contained within daylight, and also atmospheric pollution, they all act together to bring about deterioration of paper. Temperature and relative humidity. It's very difficult, particularly if your collection is stored in, perhaps say a very old monastery building, perhaps not a building that wasn't built for the purpose of being a museum or a storage area or an archive. And it's difficult. In an ideal world, perhaps we would be able to control the humidity and temperature, very accurately. But the reality for most collections, I think, is that what we're trying to do is that temperature and relative humidity should be as stable as possible, because it's the fluctuations up and down when the temperature goes up and down rapidly, and particularly that then the humidity goes up and down rapidly. And paper, just as a lot of other organic materials, absorbs and desorbs moisture very readily. So your piece of paper, which has got on your manuscript, for instance, will expand and contract, and whatever's, the paint, pigment, ink, whatever is in touch with it also will expand and contract. But it does so at a different rate. So if you have it very rapid expansion and contraction, then actual damage will occur because of that. The lower the temperature and the lower the relative humidity, as a general rule, it slows down the degradation process. So anything you can do, if you don't to even out the temperature, say in a workroom where you're working, you keep the blinds closed when you're not there. Ventilation is always a good thing, because airflow is important, because that stops, even if the humidity is quite high, it prevents mold formation. So I said prolonged higher RH levels, so that's above 65%. I'm not sure about here in Himachal how it is in the winter and the summertime, but certainly I know in other parts of India, perhaps in South India particularly, it will be where it gets a lot hotter in the summer. Sometimes the RH levels in the monsoon can go up to, 80, 90%, can't they, on a bad day? Plus the temperature is going to be 39, 40 or higher sometimes. So that's the time. All of these things, particularly in the monsoon and in the hot season here in India, that's when you have to be careful, because insect activity will go up. And we'll discuss that more, because both Anne and Teresa are going to talk about pest management. But as the humidity and the temperature goes up, so insect activity goes up. So that's the time of the year when you have to be particularly vigilant as guardians of collections. You have to be particularly watch out for the signs of mold and insect damage. Light and UV. UV should be excluded wherever possible. If, for daylight, it's possible in this day and age you can get ultraviolet absorbing films on windows. More expensive, you can get UV filtering glass and perspex. They are available, which can remove UV completely. It has no effect at all on the quality, actually the color temperature of the light. So it is possible to do that. Another simple solution is if you have like a window, north-facing window, you have a display area, then using like cotton or blinds on the windows to exclude direct daylight, not just sunlight, but direct daylight. It's one solution. Keep light levels low in display areas of the museum. Turn off light sources and close blinds when the gallery or the room is not open to the public. We looked around, didn't we, on Saturday? We went around the museum, and though everybody agrees that it is a beautiful display, there's a possibility that some of the things that are displayed at a slightly too high light level for long-term preservation. So we're thinking about tanker paintings, cloth, a lot of anything that's got natural dyes on it as well. We were looking at the people who were in my group. We were looking at a mask which had metal, cloth, naturally dyed fibres and fabrics. So light levels are important, and remember that it's not just sunlight that causes damage, it's all daylight, and we can help to reduce that by quite simple means, even if and reducing the level of light as well as UV is important to slow down deterioration. So that's all we're trying to do, is just slow down. We can't stop the processes of deterioration. We can slow them down to the point where it's an acceptable degree. So that's really what we want to do. And I'm saying not lighting areas, particularly, if you're in a workroom or something and you're not there, then pull the blinds down, put things away, cover things, and the tried and tested, the traditions here of wrapping manuscripts and putting them away is a good one, because that means the wrapper, not only does it protect the manuscript from dust and dirt, but it also helps there's no light deterioration. And if the cover suffers some deterioration, I think that's acceptable. In most cases, the cover can be replaced, but it's the idea of enclosing something in a box. And incidentally, in terms of humidity and temperature, that's another really good way to cut down the fluctuations of humidity and temperature inside your wrapped manuscript enclosure. So it's a good. Things that are on display. In Western museums, sometimes if stuff's very, very sensitive, if it's got light-sensitive dyes, they limit the light levels that it will be displayed at. Now, I don't want to get into too complicated chemistry about lux and lux levels. Just accept that lux is the unit by which light is measured, and that what we want to do is to maintain, for sensitive materials, we're looking at quite a low light level, which is 50 lux, which is quite a bit lower than the levels we saw in the museum. For things like stone, maybe, or things that are not light sensitive, and some metals and other stuff, the light level could be more like 200 lux. But there are two levels. Most paper objects, if they're painted or have dyes or have inks on them, then light levels need to be controlled in some way or another. Limiting the time things are on display. This is another way which we get round the problem of things. You say, okay, if I put my tanker on the wall and then I walk away and it's in 500 or 600 lux daylight day after day, within probably under a month you'll probably see some change in colour. And in 6 months there'll be a significant change in colour, depending on what the dyes are that it's been dyed with. So you say, well, I want to see my tanker, but it's a special, it has a special function for a particular time of the year. I'm going to have it up for a week, and then I'll put it away again, and I'll store it in the dark. So that's another idea, is just limit the amount of time things are on display. And you can differentiate between, as you become a bit more accustomed to this, some objects can withstand a certain amount of light, particularly unpainted things. I'm thinking about stone, I'm thinking about some sort of metals, and other things can't. So you need to consider what the collection is, whatever you're looking after, whether it's books, manuscripts, tankers, wooden objects, plaster objects, whatever. Think about them. And a lot of painted objects are going to have light sensitivity of one sort or another, depending on what they're painted with. As a very general rule, vegetable dyes, the sorts of things that a lot of textiles were traditionally dyed with here, in the Himalayan area, those are things that are sensitive to light. A lot of modern chemically produced dyes, some of those are particularly things that are used for modern paints and coatings. Some of those can be quite stable, but we're not talking about those. We're mainly talking about things that are sensitive. With light sources inside display cases, fluorescent tubes are not acceptable because most fluorescent light tubes emit UV, quite high amounts. So we're not going to be using UV fluorescent tubes. LED lights, depending on the make of LED light, can be very suitable inside cases. But what you need to bear in mind is that the type of light that you buy, you need to buy one that will operate at the correct, it's called the color temperature. It means that it will have the right light spread at the level of light that you want. So I don't want to go into it because I don't understand the finer points of it, but you do need to realise there are different light sources. So if you use these LED strip lights, you need to check their UV content and also check that they will work properly at the light level that you want, which is maybe a lot lower than you'd find in a domestic setting in a house or something. The advantage of LED things, by the way, is just that they don't emit heat. And I think you've seen, probably inside a showcase or in a museum thing, if you put a regular tungsten spotlight in. Tungsten, by the way, doesn't contain much UV, which is good. But tungsten generates a lot of heat, that's the problem. So inside a showcase or in a museum, that's not a good thing. So LED is good from that point of view. I was in a museum in March here in India, and they've done some great work, and they'd used these little LED strip lights inside a cupboard actually, which had a thing. But the problem was that I don't think they were the right sort of LEDs because they were actually emitting quite a lot of heat. Because it's an enclosed space inside this was in a bookshelf actually, so that's not good. And so I just said, look, you just need to get some different, it's not that LED is wrong, you need to just check that you've got the right sort of lights. Pollutants. Sulfur dioxide and dust. I'm going to talk about dust as well, because dust I think is probably as much a problem as, particularly in sort of rural areas like here in Himachal or in Ladakh or maybe in southern India. If you have something on display, if you have it inside a well-sealed, like I'm talking about like a picture, if it's inside a picture frame, that can, even if it's just sealed with paper around the outside, that can do a lot to prolong the lifespan of the object because it keeps dust and particulate matter out. If you display things, if you're storing things in your manuscript store inside wrappers or for other types of material inside boxes, again, it's actually a physical barrier against the dust and the dirt, and it keeps them out. So it's a very simple thing, but it is important. And I think, if your monastery is in a rural setting, it's probably less of a problem than somebody who's in the middle of Delhi or Bombay or Hyderabad or any of these big cities. But just bear in mind, think about enclosing things, and particularly if you're using good quality storage materials, it will help to slow down the effects of pollution. And so saying a lot of card and stuff that's made for museum purposes is made with calcium carbonate in it. Now calcium carbonate, which is contained in, it's a mineral, but it's contained in drinking water, it's contained in limestone and things. Those things, because they're alkaline by nature, they actually help to absorb pollution, and that again will help to slow down the deterioration inside any box that they're made out of. seal backs of frames. This is for art, so seal backs of frames. Use buffered mount card, which is what I'm speaking about. You can use that if boxes are made out of acid-free card. Those will also be very effective in helping to absorb pollutants. Something that we discussed a little bit when we were in the museum is about paints and varnishes used in a museum. Now, if you've got anything inside an enclosed container or in a showcase and it's got, say, a solvent-based paint, it can sometimes affect the object itself, because solvents that are contained in paints are active. They will cause changes in other materials that they're either in direct contact with or in an enclosed space with. So if you are responsible for painting something, my advice is use water-based acrylic paints. And the same thing now, you can polyurethane varnish, which is very commonly used all over the globe for sealing things, is now you can get water-based polyurethane. It's much safer. It doesn't emit harmful it's got no harmful solvents other than water in it. It's an acrylic, and acrylic which is contained in lot of modern paints or acrylics are actually a good alternative to solvent-based things. So think about that in terms of pollution. Is also stuff that you yourself maybe have applied, to your showcase or whatever. The other good thing, of course, water-based paints, they're better for the environment and they're better for you. You don't have to worry about, using solvents, and they're better for the people you're working with. So, okay, so physical damage, it's all obvious stuff. Tears, creases, losses of paper, damage to applied media. And that picks up with the handling that we've spoken about. Obviously, if I pick up my piece of paper and it's got a thick layer of paint on it and I flex it, it's probably going to cause some damage to the paint layer. Losses, if you pick up something, if carelessly by a corner, you can tear it. And you can crease things as well. So we're just thinking about when you're putting things down, perhaps like if you're working on something, make sure there's nothing underneath it, and be aware of anything. Clear a clear space, and those are the sorts of things. But honestly, that handling is one of the causes of damage to things, and you've only got to see that where things have been torn unnecessarily, just because somebody perhaps to move something. They haven't had the time just to think about where the weak areas are. If there's if you've got a tear in the middle there, what you need to do is to put, either you have to support it with your hands, or better still, you can use a sheet of blotting paper underneath it. If you've got to carry things, think about where you're going with it, clear the space where you're going to, open the doors or get somebody to hold the doors open for you. And if it's a heavy object, not perhaps a case with paper, but sometimes, then if you need 2 or 3 people, have 2 or 3 people on hand when you're moving it or carrying it. So I think that's more or less, I've just got a few examples of things that have been damaged. I mean, it's all very obvious things you can see. This is a label actually, it's a very, it's a wood pulp paper. And anything that's made of wood pulp, even though it was only 50, 60 years old, it's become very brittle. It's become, you've only got to pick it up, it just falls in two. This is something we haven't talked about so much, but this is, unfortunately, sellotape is something, again, you come across in archives a lot. People thought they were doing the right thing, put a repair on it, but sellotape is really problematic. And it causes a lot of the adhesive from the sellotape causes staining of the paper. This is supposedly a conservation alternative to sellotape called Filmoplast. But actually, Filmoplast, I've had to try and get Filmoplast because it was used in museums quite a lot in the past. I've tried to get that off paper-based objects, and I can tell you it's actually very difficult to get off. So generally avoid adhesive tapes, whether they claim to be archival or not. Just stick to doing water-based repairs with wheat starch if you can. You know, these are things that, this is a manuscript where the bottom's been damaged. I think you do get environmentally, I'm not going to talk about pest management very much because this is a slightly separate subject, but you do find, and I'm sure you've all got examples of, you know, where really bad damage, not just silverfish damage or woodworm damage, you know, where things have been eaten by rats or mice. And so you need to keep your storage areas very clean and tidy. You need to be on the watch out, and remember that it's at this time of the year when it starts to get hot and the humidity goes up, that's when often a lot of activity takes place. So keep things clean and tidy and be vigilant, you know. Have a look around and don't eat and drink in the area in which you're working or storing things. It's common sense, isn't it? You know, because you've only got to leave a paper bag with a residue of some bread or some biscuits in your bag on the floor somewhere, and before you know it, you've got a problem with mice or you've got a problem with pests. So that's very important. And most of that's common sense, isn't it? You know, we know probably your own house, you don't, particularly in the summertime, you don't leave garbage around or food waste because you know that then you're going to get cockroaches or rats and generally. So that's all, that's just basic introduction paper. It's not a very robust material. I mean, there are examples of manuscripts 1,000 years old, and the reason that those have survived often is because they're made of either cotton, linen or bast fibres that are good quality and don't deteriorate in the way in which particularly more modern paper will deteriorate. And if things are stored well, manuscripts, fortunately, because of the tradition here of wrapping manuscripts, and they're not being on display usually, that's meant that they've often survived much better than things that have been hung on the wall, you know, textiles. So anyway, I think that's all I want to say. And then I'm going to hand over to Anne. She's going to talk more about the management of collections and how you can do that. Yeah, has anyone got any questions? Is that fairly straightforward? It's, you know, it's based on science, but it's actually mostly common sense. Just thinking about how you can, you know, slow down your deterioration of things. And I think that many of the traditional practices that were done in India here and in other, you know, parts of the world where they looked after and did what we call housekeeping, you know, those are good things, and some of that's been forgotten a little bit. So part of what conservation aims to do is to try and get people reacquainted with how things were looked after traditionally. And the same probably, I know less about wall paintings, but you know, the situation in temples with wall paintings and probably with tankers as well, that tankers were only brought out and displayed for a limited period of time and were not left permanently on display.
I think to add on what you have said, you know, I think it's a kind of best practice for the conservation, you know, to have this, to limit the number of people, you know, allowed inside the conservation, because that itself will create a lot of, you know, temperature rise, because each individual comes with a lot of heat. I think make sure that there's limited people inside because most of the storage are very, you know, limited
small
space.
Confined spaces.
Yeah, confined space. I think that is what we usually, you know, try to do, and also avoid I should say edibles, because that's the, you know, way all the rodent or anything, you know.
Yeah.
I think it's common in many of the places where they casually, you know, come up with the kind of small eateries or maybe glass of teas. So I think these are, I think it's kind of.
The only thing we would really ever allow into a storage space, and it's purely for the health and safety of the people working in the is a bottle of water with a cap. And we don't usually keep it on the table, we keep it up, we keep it on the floor, we keep it out of the way, but it's got to be something that's got a cap on it. So that's what we allow into the storage space.
The other thing, I mean, there are examples, aren't there, you know, like during rituals and things that take place in the temple where you have, you know, well, butter sculptures, for instance, you know, those things you just have to be aware. I mean, we've had this discussion about the museum downstairs with the butter sculpture there, that, you know, even if it's not, it has wax, I think, with them to help it, allow it to be able to deteriorate. It'll deteriorate less, but it's a source of food, so you have to be aware of that. And butter lamps and stuff that, you know, you will find in temple, you just have to be careful because those things also are attractive to pests. Yeah. But that's a good point. You made a good point about the numbers of people. It's sort of, yeah, if you're in an enclosed space and if you have one person and you then have 10 people come in, then the temperature is going to rise and the humidity is going to rise. So if in a storage area or something like that, it's good just to limit the numbers of people. If you do tours, for instance, of your monastery or your archive, you know, certain areas maybe you need to limit the number of people, or perhaps just have only small groups of people. Yeah. Anybody else got any thoughts? I hope it makes sense anyway, but it's...
I have one question.
Yeah, yeah.
For the display work, like yesterday when we were in the museum,
yeah.
Some cases are like completely sealed,
Yeah.
and it's not kind of openable.
No.
So like, how can we make sure that, you know, particularly, you know, display openable at the same time, you know, how can we seal it?
Yeah, the question's about display cases, because we noticed in the museum that although the display cases are very beautiful and it's very nicely done, that there are big gaps, aren't there, between some of the glass. And the problem with that is that when you have a different temperature and humidity on one side of the glass than on the other, is that dust and dirt will also be drawn inside into the thing, and insects for that matter. So what you need to do is to be able to seal the showcases around the edge. Just a dust seal really is all that's needed, so that you haven't got any huge big gaps. You can't hermetically seal cases, you know, because the technology to do that is very expensive and it's not necessarily desirable. But to keep out dust and dirt and also pollution and other things, then yeah, you do need to be able to seal them better than they are at the moment. That's for sure. You can see, can't you, because if you look along the bottom of the case, you can see there's bits of debris and dust, and that just means you have to clean it more often. So that's not good either, because that means opening the showcases, and that in turn means more risk for the things inside. So it's all kind of connected up, really. Yeah.
Michael, the concern with light intensity in the museum.
Yeah.
Is it the idea that the lower the light intensity is, the better?
Yes, I mean the thing is that you need to be able to see the objects in the museum, but you know, the longer that things are on display and the higher the light level, the more the risk to things. So what we would suggest to do is general areas need to be well enough lit as well for people, so they're not bumping into things. And older visitors find this as well. You know, if you lower the light levels too far, people find it quite difficult, particularly to read the captions on the bottom. So you just have to have in terms of that, you have to have a kind of pragmatic approach to it. You think, okay, these things are really at risk. We'll have those at 50 lux. These things over here, they're at moderate risk, so we'll let them, you know, maybe 150 lux. And these things, there's not really any risk, so they could be out in the corridor, or they could be somewhere where there's actual daylight. But that's where the knowledge of materials comes in. That then lets you make an informed decision about it, saying, okay, fine.
What's the recommended flux for textile and paper? And if there is a mixed material in a display, paper, textile and metal, then what would be the average flux? for it?
Well, for long-term display, you need to think about a lux level of about around 50 lux. And that's quite low. So the other alternative is that you limit the time of display. So you say, okay, we can't see it, at 50 lux, it's, we won't be able to appreciate this object. Okay, so we have it at a slightly higher lux level, but we say that it's only going to be on display for 3 months, say. And then we replace it with something similar. Often if you've got, say, tankers or manuscripts, you may have a number of examples. So just rotate them so you don't have one object out on permanent display, because then it will just deteriorate to the point where, it won't be, will be in a very poor state of preservation. So just think about reduce the light level if you can, and if you can't, reduce the time it's on display. Exclude daylight. If you can put blinds on the windows, that will help exclude UV, and you can lower the light level that way, and you can lower so you can prevent any direct sunlight. So say in this room, and this had to be you say, okay, we're going to have a display for a year of tankers because this is auspicious for 2023. We say, well, the light levels are pretty high in here, but visitors still need to see. So we'll have a policy where we're going to we'll shut the blinds and turn all the lights off if there's no one here. So that means that immediately, we will, when people are viewing the tankers, we'll keep the cotton blinds down, and we'll keep a certain number of the lights off, so people can see things. But we will exclude direct sunlight, and we'll keep the light levels low. And say perhaps this is for a limited period of time. Say, well, okay, fine. We'll allow the light levels to be a little higher than 50 lux, but we are not going to display it. It's not suitable for a permanent display. So those are just practical things you can do. And just check, if you do have artificial light sources, just check that they don't contain UV. UV monitors are available. You can buy them over the internet. They aren't particularly cheap, but perhaps between a number of different institutions, you could share one so that you can have it. That when you get you can check. And I think here in the museum and in downstairs as well, it's well worth to get a light meter and adjust all of the light levels and check them.
If you can.
If you can, yeah. The problem we have had is when you try and dim existing light sources, sometimes if you lower the light level, if the bulb or the LED is not suitable for that light level, it will affect what we call the color temperature. And that affects, so sometimes it can make the light too green, or too yellow, or too red. And most light sources are selected so they give you a kind of an approximation of what daylight is. And that way you see colors properly, accurately. Yeah.